Hello, 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 everyone, and welcome back to another episode of History and Gaming Alexandria. This is Mike, your host, and today we'll continue our discussion about wargaming and the American Civil War out west, that is west of Texas and west of the Trans-Mississippi, by talking about the Union and their conflicts with the Apache, specifically the California Column and its march to the east through Arizona and New Mexico until it reaches Texas as the Confederates eventually withdraw, and the conflict between the Union and the Chiricahua Apache under Mangas Coloradas, Cochise, and even Geronimo, which culminated in a key battle between the Federal Army from California and the Apaches, a joint Apache force at the Battle of Apache Pass in July of 1862. We'll also talk about the key Bascom Affair, which angered the Apaches greatly and set off literally decades of endless war between the Apache tribes and the United States government, as well as the Confederate States and their forces in the area, as we discussed in our last video when we covered the growth of Confederate Arizona in detail and focused specifically on the various conflicts between the Confederate and secessionist militias in Confederate Arizona and the local Apache tribes. And these involved the siege of Tubac, where Tubac was relieved by a Confederate militia from Tucson led by Granville Ory, as well as the key Battle of Pinos Altos, a mining town in Confederate Arizona, and that was attacked by a large number of Apaches led by Mangas Coloradas and Cochise, and was ultimately driven off by the combined efforts, very creative efforts of the local civilian population and the Arizona Guards led by Thomas Maston, who we also discussed in our previous episode, both of which occurred during the summer of 1861. As we get into 1862, we have the Union Army from California stepping into this maelstrom, stepping into this fiery situation that's brewing in the desert Southwest. And so, as we noted in our previous episode, the Arizona Territory had always been, that is, the southern part of the New Mexico Territory that followed on the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo and the Gadsden Purchase of 1853. That southern New Mexico Territory had always felt itself independent and cut off from the territorial government in Santa Fe, and ultimately in 1861, in 1861, that territory formed a constitutional convention and proclaimed itself its own independent Arizona territory. An individual named Lewis Owings was elected territorial governor, the leader of the territory, with Granville Ory as the Chief Justice of the court, among other officials who formed a provisional government of Arizona. Now, on or around March 28th of 1861, that this newly formed Arizona Territory, the provisional government, does vote to separate from New Mexico and join the Confederacy. This has the effect of just increasing the Union officials and their fears of a secessionist movement to separate Southern California from the United States, among other things. And it's notable that Albert Sidney Johnston, who's at this time anyway, a Union officer in California, among other um, secessionist sympathizers, such as Armistead, they essentially enlist in the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles, which is one of many pro-Confederate secessionist type militias that emerge in Arizona and California, especially Southern California, around this time period. And for the most part, they are involved in smuggling individuals with Southern sympathies and military officers, among other things, uh, east in order to join the Confederacy. And it is under in this situation, that Albert Sidney Johnston enlists as a private in the Los Angeles Mounted Rifles and makes his way across what becomes Tucson and later Confederate Arizona, where he makes his way to Mesilla right around the time that Baylor has taken over. They reach Confederate Arizona around July 4th of 1861. And by the time that Baylor arrives, he actually asks Albert Sidney Johnston to take command of the local forces there, which is interesting. At which point, Johnston, as well as Lewis Armistead, are mustered out and make their way to Texas and onto their future in the American Civil War. Lewis Armistead, of course, being killed at the height of Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and Albert Sidney Johnston falling at Shiloh. So interesting personalities that make their way through this particular theater in the West. And now we'll rewind to January of 1861 in order to delve into the key Bascom Affair, which really set off a wave of depredations and attacks by the Apache tribes against the United States and later the Confederate forces. Prior to this, the Apaches had a long tradition of conflict with the Mexican government, going back to Mexico's independence from Spain and its attempts to occupy the territory of former New Spain or Nueva España. And prior to that, the Spanish royal government had experienced years of on and off negotiation and conflict and periods of peace between the Mescalero Apaches, the Mimbreños, the various Apache tribes in the areas of what they called Apacheria. And for the most part, the leadership of the Apaches, which at that time largely consisted of their chief Mangas Coloradas, as well as Cochise, who became Mangas Coloradas's son-in-law. Now, Mangas Coloradas, his name was given to him by the Mexicans, meaning colored sleeves or red sleeves. Now, that could be a result of a colorful shirt that he wore. It could also be a name they gave him due to the bloodiness of you know, his sleeves or his arms due to the raiding and the other attacks that he led against the Spanish and the Mexicans. In any case, Mangas Coloradas, as is discussed both in Megan Kate Nelson's great book, The Three-Cornered War, which covers Mangas in some detail, as well as the Conquest of Apacheria by Dan L. Trapp. Mangas Coloradas was born likely between 1790 and 1795, likely somewhere in southern New Mexico. And in any case, he was a very large man for an Apache. He stood about 6'6", and he was considered to be intelligent and a very influential leader. He was particularly effective at uniting various Apache tribes, not only his own band, but through marriage of his daughters to Cochise and even to some Navajo tribes, he was able to unite a number of bands and tribes and they're in the Apacheria area, and to amass a, a larger number of warriors that he could call upon compared to really any Apache leader preceding him. And certainly he was very influential, and he had a great influence on Cochise, who was younger than he was, as well as Geronimo, who was even younger and who continued to lead the Apache during the Apache Wars against the United States. Now, initially, as noted, Mangas Coloradas was very open to the North Americans being in the area, as the Mexicans had been the traditional enemy of the Apache, particularly during the 1820s and 30s with the independence of Mexico from Spain, that occurring in 1821. By 1835, Mexico had placed a bounty on Apache scalps, and this simply exacerbated the conflict between the Apaches and the new Mexican government. As noted, the government of the royal government of Spain, or New Spain, had a reasonable amount of success through the system of presidios that they had developed in stabilizing relationships with the Apaches, at least for some periods of time, although the conflict obviously persisted. But the Mexican government in particular did not have the resources that Spain had. They didn't have the ability to staff the presidios, to pay the Apache, to provide them with food, and therefore discourage them from the economic benefits of raiding. And so, with the independence of Mexico from Spain, you really have an explosion of violence breaking out and raids breaking out between the Apache and the Mexicans, which was quite bloody. And Mangas Coloradas really comes into his own during that period. Now, in 1846, during the start of the Mexican American War, he actually meets and negotiates with Brigadier General Stephen Watts Kearny, and is quite open to the Americans being in the area, being at war with Mexico, and he offers his warriors as allies, and he offers the Americans safe passage through the Apacheria territory, provided that the Americans rid the area of Mexico, and offers to help them do it, in fact, and attempts to negotiate other terms with Kearny. Notably, he even tells Kearny Mangas Coloradas spoke Spanish fluently in addition to the Apache languages. He said, Nuestra gente tiene un odio eterno de los mexicanos, or our people have a strong and long-standing or everlasting hatred of the Mexicans, as was translated to Kearny. And so Mangos Coloradas is initially very open to the North Americans being in the area. This sours after a series of incidents involving the miners from the Pinos Altos area who settle on Apache lands, and it really comes to a head in 1861, particularly January of 1861, with the Bascom Affair, which we'll discuss right now. Now, the Bascom Affair originates on January 27th of 1861 when a group of Apache raiders, possibly Tonto Apaches or Piñol Apaches, there's some speculation of them being from the Coyotero band, but in any case, they raid a ranch owned by John Ward located at Sonaita Creek. And the background on the Wards are that John Ward had made his way from California, from San Francisco, and made his way to the Presidio at Tubac in 1857, before essentially failing at various enterprises and making his way to the area of Sonaita. Now, his mistress or wife, alternatively, is a Mexican woman named Jesusa Martinez, who had also migrated to the area, likely from Sonora. There is one version of events which indicates she traveled as a servant among a party of Mexicans, had been abducted by the Apache herself, and fathered and had a son with an Apache warrior. Another version indicates that she had her sons with a Mexican man named Teles in Mexico. In any case, she has two children with her, one a boy of about 10 to 11 years old named Felix, and she comes to live with John Ward at his ranch, which is located along the Sonaita River, about a dozen miles west of Fort Buchanan, which had been established in 1856 between the towns of Sonaita and uh, Patagonia. Now, on that date in 1861, this band, January 27th, 1861, the band of Apaches essentially raid the ranch while John Ward is out of the area, and they steal several head of livestock and cattle and also scoop up and abduct Felix Ward, who Ward's 12-year-old or 11-year-old stepson, who's playing in a tree on the property. They grab him and make off with him as well as the cattle and head for the nearby hills. Now, Ward returns and reports the raid immediately and the outrage to the nearby authorities. A Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, the commandant of Fort Buchanan, which we discussed, and he directs a second lieutenant, George Bascom, who is a recent West Point graduate, to take 54 men and try to figure out what happened and essentially locate the boy and the cattle and have them returned to Ward. And this incident essentially is the spark that sets off the Bascom Affair and the violence that follows. Now, Morrison orders George Bascom to use whatever means necessary to punish the kidnappers and recapture the boy. And Bascom, with his 54 men, they journey eastwards towards the traditional stronghold of the Apaches, called Apache Pass. And they arrive there several days after the kidnapping on February 3rd of 1861. Now, as we mentioned, Apache Pass is this stronghold of the Apache, particularly the Chiricahua Apache, which is in the heart of the Apacheria territory. Now, as a natural freshwater spring, Apache Spring emerges from a geological fault line that runs through this pass, and it's a significant area. It's the only reliable water source for many, many miles, and it's served as a critical point of supply and resupply for early travelers, for the Apaches who live in the area, for the U.S. Army at various points, and for others, occupying the territory. Now, for the Apache in particular, it becomes a key crossroads with many trails emanating from it. And it's essentially a key meeting point for the Apache bands in this area. Now, the Spanish and the Mexican settlers also used it extensively, and it had become a flashpoint for various conflicts between the Apache tribes and the Spanish and the Mexicans, which led to its name in Spanish being Puerto del Dado, or the pass, or the doorway of the dice, or of the die, meaning basically referring to the chance you would be taking by entering that area and the risky nature of crossing into it, basically being a roll of the dice as to whether you might survive that. And so Apache Pass is this key crossroads. It's very key because of the freshwater spring there, which makes it very important in the entire Apacheria territory. And when Bascom and his 54 men, which according to some sources included John Ward as well as an interpreter, enter this pass, Puerto del Dado, they're taking a huge risk. They're quite literally rolling the dice on this expedition, but again, they're trying to find Felix Ward, who was abducted at the end of January 1861, and on February 3rd, they make it to Apache Pass, and there they arrange a meeting with none other than the Chiricahua chief Cochise, the son-in-law of Mangas Now, Cochise, who was born about 18 on or around 1823 or 1824, is some significantly younger than Mangas Coloradas, his father-in-law. He is a key leader, however, of the Chiricahua Apache in this area, and he agrees to come out and arrange a parley with Bascom once he is approached by the army. And on or about February 4th, they meet in a tent for a parley, an exchange, and a discussion, in which Cochise essentially denies any knowledge of the boy, um, essentially indicating that neither his band nor the bands associated with Mangos Colorados had any role in the abduction of Ward or the raid on the ranch. He speculated that it may have been one of the other Apache bands, such as the Coyoteros, and he did, however, promise to follow up on this and try to figure out which band may have been involved and try to work with the other tribes and attempt to recover the boy. Bascom, however, does not believe any of this. And there are a couple different versions of what happens, but during the negotiations, according to Megan Kate Nelson's account in The Three-Cornered War, Cochise indicates that it's reasonable that the Western Apaches, such as the Coyoteros, who were only distantly related to the Chiricahuas and lived near Ward's ranch, had taken the boy, and Cochise offers to send emissaries to them to negotiate for the boy's release. Bascom does initially seem amenable to this plan, and they settle in to eat their dinner. However, as they eat, Bascom gives the orders for his soldiers to surround the tent. And as they finish their meal, Bascom informs Cochise that he will not allow him to leave, and it has every intention of holding him and the members of his party, which include his family members, as hostages until the boy is found and returned. Now Cochise is surprised and then enraged. As the soldiers surround the tent, he personally jumps up, draws out a knife from one of his legs, from one of his boots, and leaps for the back of the tent and slices his way through and makes an escape with several of his party. However, his brother, Coyontera, and several other members of his band, including his relatives, are captured and taken back to Bascom's tent and secured, as Cochise runs back to his own camp near Apache Pass to gather his warriors and retaliate. Now, as Cochise runs back to his camp, despite being fired on by up to 50 soldiers. He dodges the bullets along with the escaped Apaches as the Chiricahuas make it back to their camp near Apache Spring. The troops under Bascom clearly know that trouble is coming, trouble is brewing in the Puerto del Dado, the pass of the roll or the gateway to the rolling of the dice. They are in some trouble here. Now they fall back to the Butterfield stage station, which is a small stagecoach station along the Butterfield route, which runs near the pass and is also featured on the map that I drew, which you can see as well. And they maneuver their wagons along one edge, packing the empty spaces between the wooden slats with grain sacks in order to set up a sort of a defensive position. Again, they know what's likely coming their way. They also dig a trench and send men up to Apache Spring in order to fill their canteens and gather water. At the same time, Cochise charges down and captures some men associated with the Butterfield station, an agent and several stagecoach passengers who are unlucky enough to arrive during this situation, and he takes several hostages of his own in the meantime. Now, Cochise in particular, this being on February 4th, attempts to seize a number of hostages, and he captures the stage station keeper, a hostler, and a stage driver who apparently knows Cochise, and he takes them prisoner. Some of them attempt to escape. One of them is killed in the process, and Cochise also sacks a small wagon train 2 miles west of the mail station that evening, and in an attempt to gather as many hostages as he can and increase his bargaining power with Bascom to recover members of his party, including his family members. Now, in terms of the actual attack and the actual battle, as noted, the U.S. troops under Bascom attempt to water their horses near or in Apache Spring, and Cochise's men ride toward the herd and drive off the animals, driving them into the hills. And for several days, the Chiricahua Apache rain gunfire down upon the Federals from the high ridges around the station. Now, at this time, it's worth noting that Bascom has his men construct some fortifications around Apache Spring, and these may remain during another battle that occurs here later on in 1862, which we'll get into later. But bear in mind that, especially for battlefield archaeology purposes, it becomes quite difficult later in history to distinguish between some of the fortifications that were constructed by Bascom's men in the area and fortifications used by the Chiricahua Apaches against the Federal Army the following year in 1862. So, interesting point to note as we talk about the later battle, which is on a much larger scale, but which essentially starts here in early February of 1861 between Bascom and Cochise over their hostages. Now, in terms of the actual shooting, as Dan Thrapp explains in his book, The Conquest of Apacheria, from February 5th to February 8th, it appears that Cochise and the Apaches essentially attack the Federals, firing at them. They do initially especially on February 6th. They appear with an interpreter, an individual named Wallace, who's one of the prisoners, and attempt to arrange a prisoner exchange. involving the interpreter and about 16 federal mules, part of the animals that were stampeded in exchange for the Indian prisoners, the Apache prisoners. Bascom refuses the trade, insisting that unless the boy Felix Ward is returned, there's no deal. Now that evening, there is some further attempt at negotiation, and Thrapp in particular raises the question, and there is some dispute over who exactly is responsible here. Megan Nelson and indeed other sources portray Bascom as rash and somewhat. The implication is that he's somewhat inexperienced and that this is poor judgment on his part. But Thrapp goes into more detail, raising the question of with Cochise and Bascom essentially agreeing in principle on a peaceful trade of prisoners, at least the idea of it, because there is some indication in Thrapp sources that a note was received later that evening from Wallace reporting that Cochise held other prisoners and was open to agree to an exchange. So the question becomes, why did this fail to come off? Why did it result in bloodshed when both Cochise and Bascom were apparently open to some sort of exchange of prisoners? And the answer can only lie, Thrapp writes, in the arrival of a U.S. Army surgeon named Bernard J.D. Irwin, along with an escort from Fort Buchanan on February 10th, and the later arrival of a First Lieutenant Isaiah Moore from Fort Breckenridge with 70 men, all before Cochise could obtain the boy from the Apache band which held him and negotiate with his own fellow Apaches for the release of the boy, and before a deal could essentially be made. Now, it's worth noting, of course, that during the conflict, Bascom sends for more men. He also sends requests for medical assistance, as there are some reports, some sources indicating that federal casualties, including 2 sergeants, were lost or wounded. And Bascom does send on a request for medical assistance. And of course, Irwin arrives, U.S. Army surgeon. And it does appear that with the arrival of this considerable force in the Apacheria, Cochise and other Apaches likely took this presence of additional federal army troops as bad faith, as a sign of bad faith and a military operation against them, despite the understanding with Bascom. And on or about February 17th or 18th, it does appear that they start executing prisoners. And on February 19th, it does appear that Bascom permits 3 of his adult male prisoners and several others who had been captured to be hanged near the site of Apache Pass. Prior to this, somewhat earlier, Cochise and the Apaches do kill several of their prisoners and leave their corpses in the area of Apache Pass as they withdraw following the standoff of several days. And it's Dan Thrapp who attributes this to the presence of the reinforcements, including the request for medical assistance and the large number of federal troops in the area. In any case, a number of prisoners are executed by the Apaches, and the federal forces follow suit on or about February 19th. Now, Bascom, who does receive criticism historically for this, it does appear that he is not enthusiastic about killing any of his prisoners, which do include several of Cochise's relatives. Bascom apparently at first demurred, according to Thrapp, but Irwin, again the medical officer, is a superior to him in rank. So he's outranked by Irwin, who arrives with this support column. And Irwin insists on hanging his 3 prisoners anyway. And so Lieutenant Bascom essentially gives in, and the deed is done. And as Thrapp states, and a quarter century of tumultuous Apache hostilities were essentially started off by this affair. And Cochise's fury is even enhanced because 3 of the individuals who were hanged are, of course, his close relatives, and within 60 days, approximately 150 white settlers are killed by the Apaches, and it sets off a series of raids and depredations throughout this time period, both involving the Federal Army, which again um, essentially retreats due to the start of the American Civil War from some of the fortresses, and the forces of Baylor and the Confederate States start to enter the territory, as we discussed in our previous episode. But the so-called Bascom Affair, or the as the Apaches came to call it, the Cut the Tent Affair, again coming from Cochise's daring escape, in which he sliced or cut a big hole in the tent and fled with as many of his party as could escape with him, stands out in U.S. relations with the Apaches as a major event, and indeed a pivotal event that sets off a long period of violence between the Apaches, who had prior to this largely been traditional enemies with the Mexicans and the Spanish before that. They are now staunch enemies of the U.S. and later the Confederate forces in this territory. Now, it's worth noting here that Bascom, despite the bad rap that he gets historically, does not really have much of an opportunity to defend himself and his judgment here. Bascom is he's originally born in Kentucky. He's apparently of French Huguenot and French Basque descent. He does graduate from West Point, and he's a relatively recent graduate, having finished in 1858, ranked 27th in his class. So graduates West Point in 1858, and in January of 1861, he's involved in the Bascom Affair as a second lieutenant of the United States 7th Infantry Regiment in the New Mexico Territory, based at Fort Buchanan, when he's ordered out to recover the Ward boy at Apache Pass. Now, unfortunately, Bascom at age 22 is killed at none other than the Battle of Valverde, which we discussed in our previous episodes, and he is killed by Confederate forces on February 21st during the Union retreat across the Rio Grande. And according to Megan Nelson's account, one of the Union troops in the area recognized Bascom. He had been killed in the Rio Grande as the rebels were firing upon the retreating Union forces, and he is killed at age 22 in the retreat. And so Bascom does not have the opportunity to leave extensive memoirs on this period and on his reflections and his actions in this incident. Now, I think it is fair to say that he is a young officer and that he is tasked with attempting to recover a young boy who was abducted. And so he's trying to follow orders. He's trying to use leverage to obtain the child and the return of the child, as well as the livestock. And one could perhaps understand his interest in trying to hold Kochi's essentially captive until a deal was made. You also have to take into the account the attitudes of the U.S. Army at the time. They generally looked upon the Apaches as criminals and raiders, even pests, almost like wild animals, who routinely raided, murdered, and stole, and therefore they were reluctant to deal with them on an equal level and treat them as both as equals. Part of this is, of course, racism, but part of it also is this notion that the Apache cannot be trusted simply because their way of life involves stealing and raiding on a regular basis. Attempting to take Cochise hostage, probably not the best decision in retrospect, but it's the decision that he makes. How pivotal it is a bit unclear to me. It is really the arrival of Irwin and the decision, again by an individual who outranks Bascom, to execute the hostages, that really turns this into a sordid affair and touches off a lot of irreconcilable conflict with the Apache that essentially does not end until the end of the Apache Wars in earnest, many years later. We could also make the argument that the United States, although it won the war with Mexico in spectacular fashion, defeating the Mexican army, occupying huge swathes of territory all the way from Texas to California, unquestionably, undoubtedly won the war in a spectacular fashion, but fundamentally lost the peace that followed in an important way. And one of the key aspects of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was that, yes, the United States occupied all of this territory, reaching essentially the Pacific Ocean, which is a strategic success for the United States. It also, as part of the treaty, it assumes responsibility for the native tribes in the area, specifically preventing them from raiding and marauding into Sonora and Chihuahua and into Mexico. The Mexicans agree to this treaty, but of course they're afraid of the Apache. And if the United States is going to occupy this land, then the United States must agree to enforce the international border and to ensure that the Apache do not leave American territory and steal and loot Mexican lands. And so this becomes a huge problem. And as the American forces enter the Apacheria, the Apache consider this their homeland. They want to be treated and dealt with as an independent entity, and they want to essentially they look at the situation as the United States needing their permission to use their territory to have safe passage through it. They want to be seen as equals, perhaps allies, but they resent the fact that the United States is coming in, attempting to take property that has been stolen from Mexico by the Apache, including slaves that the Apache have taken from Mexico, and essentially trying to return this property to the local governments in Sonora and Chihuahua. And so you essentially have this situation that is baked into the treaty. And you could make the argument that the United States, again, won the Mexican American War spectacularly, but also lost the peace because elements of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo essentially guaranteed that the United States would be not only perpetually at war with the Apache, Comanche, and other Indian Native American tribes in the area, indeed, right up until the end of the 19th century, but it also exacerbated the tensions between North and South and essentially overheated the political system over the slavery issue because the agrarian agricultural South and the industrial North, rather than having the breathing space to potentially resolve the question of slavery and abolition over time, um, these issues were made much more urgent and the conflict much sharper and more exacerbated. So there were a number of burdens or more likely requirements on the United States as part of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Article 12, for instance, engaged the U.S. to pay in consideration of the land acquired $15 million, or around $550 million in today's term, in annual installments. The United States also assumed the Mexican government's debts in that area, particularly involving American settlers, and notably, Article 11 of the treaty, which was very important to Mexico, provided that the United States would prevent and actually punish raids by Native Americans into Mexico, and prohibited the Americans from acquiring property, livestock, or taken by the Indian tribes in those raids. And it stated that the U.S. would return any captives taken by the Native Americans back to Mexico. And the Mexicans believed that the U.S. had encouraged and assisted the Comanche and Apache raids in the years preceding the war, and this article promised them some sort of relief. It however, proved to be unenforceable and just too difficult. Destructive raids by the native tribes continued despite a heavy American presence around the border area, and Mexico, in fact, filed as many as 366 claims against the U.S. government for damages done by the Apache and the Comanche from 1848 to 1853. And it is in 1853, in the Treaty of Mesilla, a city that we'll remember from our previous episode, The Treaty of Messina, which concluded the Gadsden Purchase, actually annulled Article 11, which obligated the United States to enforce this policy towards the Apache and the Comanche. And so, regardless of Bascom's actions, the assumption of these responsibilities, however, for however many years up until 1853, essentially put the United States into conflict with the Apache, with the Comanche, and the nature of American settlers moving through and into this area made conflict fairly inevitable, absent a federal policy that would treat the Apache as a sort of independent state, the Apacheria as some sort of equal partner or ally, sort of in the same vein as the British, you know, prior to that had treated some of the Indian tribes as allies and partners. That was the sort of arrangement that the Apache were more or less expecting, from what I can gather based on my research and readings, and the United States, largely due to its own priorities as well as due to its treaty obligations until 1853, made that fairly impossible. And Bascom's decisions are, it's important to see them in context. Whatever misjudgments he made in the heat of the moment are obviously his responsibility, but at the same time, there are conflicts here that are simply inevitable based upon the arrangements and the situation in the region following the end of the Mexican-American War. However, the human story behind the Bascom Affair is every bit as interesting as the military and political one. In fact, it's a much more interesting story in many ways. Because John Ward and Jesusa Martinez, as noted, they were the mother and the stepfather of Felix Ward or Felix Martinez. Now, John Ward passed away in 1867, having had several other children with Jesusa Martinez, who also passed away um, following Ward's death. And they had always believed that Felix Ward had either been killed by the Apaches or essentially perished in the raid, but nothing could be farther from the truth. In fact, Felix Ward, or Felix Ateles, as he came to be known, lived right up until 1914 to an old age. And as the story turns out, Felix Ward was not killed by the Apaches. He had been abducted by White Mountain Apaches, a tribe of the Western Apache bands, and he had been essentially adopted into their tribe as a warrior. He participated in their peace smoking ceremonies, and he even became a sort of foster brother to John Rope, who became a truly legendary Apache scout who eventually received the Medal of Honor from the United States. Now, Felix Telles, about 11 years after his abduction, so he lives for 11 years as a White Mountain Apache tribesman, tribal warrior, essentially. Um, on or around 1872, he enlists in the Apache Scouts of the United States Army. And he comes to be an associate of Al Sieber, who's a commander of the Scouts. And Al Sieber describes him, he's now known as Mickey Free, after an Irish immigrant character and soldier in a novel of the period due to his non-Native American, non-Apache appearance. He looked very Irish, and indeed his biological father, Santiago Teles, has been described in various sources, including Dan Thrapp's The Conquest of Apacheria, as half Irish and half Hispanic. And so he has this very distinctive look with long reddish hair. And Felix Teles enlists in the Apache Scouts. He serves under Al Sieber and other significant Apache Scout commanders. Notably, Al Sieber describes him, according to one source, as half Mexican, half Irish, and one whole SOB. So he is a tough Apache scout. He's also a bounty hunter who pursues various prominent Apaches as part of his career in the Apache Scouts, and he pursues Geronimo and other significant um, uh, Chiricahua Apaches and others for the U.S. Army, where his languages come into great use. He is fluent in Spanish due to his mother and his upbringing and his early life in Mexico and living with his mother, of course. Jesus Martinez in English due to his growing up in the New Mexico territory and no doubt his stepfather, John Ward, who is also I believe, an Irish immigrant or part Irish as well, according to some sources. And of course, growing up with the White Mountain Apache, he becomes fluent in the Apache dialect. So he's a bit of a linguist, a rough character from the Wild West. Essentially, this young boy grows into one where he joins the Apache Scouts, becomes known as Mickey Free, and you could see a picture of him here, and he's apparently in some other group photos of Apache Scout units that he was associated with. And he is a fascinating character of the Old West, and what an amazing human story from this Bascom affair. Apparently, one of Jesus Martinez's other children, Carlos, essentially finds him around 1881 and realizes that this is his half brother and went to see him and tried to persuade him to come home, but Teles does not do so. He remains on White Mountain, where he eventually retires from the Apache Scouts and lives on the reservation until 1914. He also had multiple wives, I believe 4 wives. And so, amazing story. Felix Ward, abducted by the Apache in 1861, key figure, unwitting player in the Bascom Affair, becomes a U.S. Army Apache Scout. And it's these types of human stories that truly bring this period alive and make it relatable. But now we'll return to the historical and political significance of the conflict with the Apache and discuss how to bring some of these aspects and some of these characters to the tabletop in simulations and scenarios. And we can talk about the key battle at Apache Pass and fast forward to the middle of 1862, and specifically July 15th to 16th, 1862. And we'll return to a topic that we discussed in our previous episodes, and this is the California Column of California troops led by Colonel Carleton, later promoted en route from California to the New Mexico territory to Brigadier General Carleton. And we'll discuss the role of the California Column and the California troops in these key battles. And so, as noted, the California Column, commanded by Colonel Carleton, departs from Tucson, and there's an advance party led by a Captain Roberts, which leaves Tucson on July 10th of 1862. This is only about 5 days before the Battle of Apache Pass, which took place over 2 days in the middle of July. Now, several days later, as noted, he and his advanced force, they reach Apache Pass with part of his column. He had approximately 100 men. This is primarily infantry with approximately 6 cavalrymen, supply wagons, livestock, and importantly, 2 mountain howitzers. Now, the soldiers had been on a long trek. They'd marched approximately 40 miles in unforgiving sun in that morning, and they were eager to reach the water that was contained at Apache Spring and get some much needed rest during what was becoming the hottest part of the day. And so they did not particularly expect trouble at that time. There had been a few incidents, some skirmishes with the Apache by other advance elements in the days prior. However, they were not aware of those incidents. Now, in terms of the exact number of men entering Apache Pass, the excellent article by the National Park Service, which is an archaeological and assessment, a battlefield archaeology assessment of the Apache Pass site. They explain that the exact number of men entering Apache Pass with Captain Roberts may never be known. Although he left Tucson with 72 men in his company, he assigned 12 of them to help a Captain Cremoni with the wagons, and this left Roberts entering the pass with approximately 60 infantrymen, 21 men with the battery, the two mountain howitzers themselves, which had been obviously disassembled and were being carried on mules, as well as 6 cavalrymen, so making the total about 87 enlisted men. Now, in addition, there were 3 teamsters. These would be in charge of the wagon train, a First Lieutenant Thompson, an Assistant Surgeon William McKee, a guide named Andrew Furlong, and obviously Captain Roberts himself, bringing the total to about 94. And so there is some speculation we have approximately 100 men, more likely 94, possibly less, depending on the situation with the wagon train and the Teamsters. So the National Park Service article further clarifies that on or around July 10th, Roberts leaves the Tucson area for San Simon, reporting his troop strength at 72 men with Company E, 1st California Infantry, 24 with Company B of the 2nd California Cavalry under Captain John C. Cremoni, 20 with the battery of the 2 mountain howitzers, which were under 1st Lieutenant William A. Thompson, 10 men with a detachment of Company H, 1st California Infantry, under First Lieutenant Alexander McGowan, and 22 teams under Wagon Master Jesse Allen, for a total of 126 soldiers and 242 animals. Now, there are less men, of course, under his command as he actually goes into the location of Apache Pass, as we discussed. Captain Roberts' command enters Apache Pass at around 12:30 p.m. on July 15th with about 94 officers and men. Now, he's not aware of the previous month's events and skirmishes in the area in which several federal troops were killed, and only took normal precautions as the men start to enter the pass. And as the weary column marches along, they eagerly anticipate stopping at an old stone station building, a stage station building that came into sight, and of course, enjoying the water and a much needed rest near the spring. Now, we will turn to the question of armaments in more detail and discuss the armaments of the Union forces, as well as particularly the weapons and equipment of the Apache during this battle. And they are quite interesting. Now, we have discussed the California Column's howitzers, and these do play a pivotal role in the first and second day at Apache Pass. Now, as noted, the battery was under Thompson, and the mountain howitzers appear to be from the Benicia Arsenal near San Francisco, although others, according to the National Park Service article, may have been left by other companies of, for instance, the 3rd Artillery when they were shipped east. As early as February of 1862, correspondence appears to mention gun crews practicing with shell as well as blank cartridges, and one battery of 2 mountain howitzers and 20 men was sent east to the Pima villages, somewhere between Fort Yuma and Tucson, under command of a First Lieutenant Jeremiah Phelan in late March. When Captain Roberts' company arrives at Fort Yuma, he had 2 mountain howitzers with him and 16 men to fire them, and Lieutenant Thompson was put in command of these howitzers through a special order. They were mounted on prairie carriages and pulled by mules, and were to be kept ready at a moment's notice. And the crews consisted of approximately 16 infantry who had been drilled and trained in California, likely under regular Army supervision, but allowed to keep their rifles, which is a decision that would have some key ramifications during the battle, particularly as there was a lack of artillery fire due to the men being tempted to protect themselves, the crews being tempted to protect themselves from the Apache by shooting back with their own rifles. So, continuing on the subject of armaments, the infantrymen in the California column would have been issued with a Model 1855 Springfield rifle musket, and the model utilized the Maynard tape priming system, in which the primers, which looked like a roll of caps basically, were located inside the breech block and enclosed by a small door. And if this door were to come open during the heat of battle in a firefight, well, the roll of primers could fall out, thereby making the rifle inoperable. Now, Carleton, understanding the logistical need to keep his ammunition and equipment standard and also effective in the conditions in which the California column would be marching, Carleton ordered and received standard percussion caps to be used due to the tape primers misfiring issue. And so this was a benefit to the California column. Now, apparently, the artillerymen, do have some training in addition to what they received in California. As noted, um, the battery had arrived at Tucson in June, late June, and after spending time at Camp Barrett and Camp Canada del Oso, on July 7th, the battery drilled with blanks under the supervision of regular Army artillery officers, and then subsequently accompanied Roberts's command, leaving for the Apache Pass area on or around July 10th. It also received several more men, bringing their total strength to 21 men, 15 animals, and one wagon. And they carried a spherical case, shell, and canister, all fixed ammunition. And so, turning to the logistical efforts of Carleton in equipping and ensuring the success of the California column, it's important to note that Carleton was an experienced veteran at this point. He had been involved in conflicts in New England as well as other conflicts with Native Americans, and he knew that supplying his army presented one of the most formidable duties that he faced, and that involved standardization of his command, which held the key to success in this instance. And in doing so, he acquired standard weapons and equipment that could be repaired, replaced, or have ammunition readily available to the extent possible. And Carleton issued the California Volunteers the best weapons he could acquire, the cavalry receiving the Sharps new model 1859, breech loading carbine in 52 caliber, the model 1840 cavalry saber, and as a sidearm, the model 1851 Colt Navy revolver in 36 caliber. The infantry, as noted, was issued the model 1855 Springfield rifle musket, 58 caliber, as well as the 18-inch triangular bayonet. Now, we noted the Springfield had this rather innovative priming system called the Maynard priming system, and Carleton made some adjustments to that in order to help the weapons from prevent the weapons from misfiring. So, although he had access to this more modern Maynard priming system, Carleton chose to issue the tried and true copper percussion caps in order to avoid this risk of the paper caps absorbing moisture and becoming unusable. Weapons were issued to the Teamsters for their own self-defense. The Model 1841 Mississippi rifle in 54 caliber and the 44 caliber Colt Dragoon revolver were issued to the Teamsters. These probably only saw action during the initial ambush. And so the weapons of the California column were fairly modern. They were pretty good. They still involved some diversity of calibers, and so there were some supply issues, but Carleton tried to keep those to quite a minimum. In order to better appreciate what happens during the Battle of Apache Pass, let's turn to the training and the proficiency of both sides with their weapons. We did discuss some of the training that the howitzer crews had obtained both in San Francisco and around Fort Yuma prior to this engagement. Now, although the sides turn out to be equally well armed, aside from the Federal Army's advantage, due to the howitzers, neither side had gained particular proficiency with the firearms to have a huge advantage. For the most part, the Apaches, with their relatively recent weapons acquisitions, had virtually no instruction. So, with most of their limited supply of ammunition, They had accumulated that through raiding or trading. They didn't have a sufficient quantity required for target practice. They did figure out the fundamentals of firing on flat ground and at short ranges. And so they'd become very effective in the art of the ambush, according to the National Park Service article, and close quarters fighting. However, dealing with elevation changes and issues of firearms trajectory was a major problem for them, as became clear during the battle. However, what an Apache warrior may lack in understanding his weapon, he made up for in natural abilities, knowledge of the terrain, years of hunting, raiding, and knowing the local area obviously gave the Apaches some tactical advantage that was significant, making them formidable opponents. Now, the Federal Army, on the other hand, regularly drilled with their weapons. They'd gained familiarity with basic operation and had a general knowledge of firearms trajectory, which their officers, of course, reinforced during the battle, provided they were, able to communicate that in the heat of battle and exert their influence over the troops. Although the Army at that point lacked an established system of target practice, the California Column did receive more firearms training than most, and members of the column drilled in squads and also as skirmishers en tirailleurs. Their commanders did allow them to fire at game, at animals as they marched, and as well as on sentinel duty. And so they did have some extra firearms training, which does indicate that the troops drilled on foot and on horseback and improved their aim with the weapons they were issued. Now, the Apaches were well armed by the time of this conflict with the Federal column in Apache Pass. Traditionally, the weapons used by the Apache had their limitations. They involved traditional weapons such as bows and arrows and spears. However, none of these were used at Apache Pass, as by that time the Apache had become fairly well armed. Previously, they obtained weapons through their conflict with the Mexicans, through raiding, stealing, and trading. And in those days, before the Civil War in the United States, guns were fairly scarce. And again, they were typically captured from the Mexicans and from settlers and raids. Now, by this time, however, between the Bascom Affair of February 1861 and July of 1862, the Apaches had amassed a significant number of firearms through their various activities that by contemporary standards of the day, they were considered well armed. And Sergeant Albert Fountain affirms that the Apaches were well armed, and others, such as Lieutenant Colonel Edward Eyre, who had an encounter with Cochise's Apaches 2 weeks prior to the battle, supported this statement. In his July 6, 1862 report, he indicated that all of them were armed with firearms, some with rifles and six-shooting pistols. Of the latter, I observed a great number, and occasionally single-barreled shotguns. All of them have carbines and some rifles, shotguns, six-shooters, and all kinds of arms that we use. In fact, they are just as well armed as we are. He even mentions that the leader, Cochise, had a fine rifle and two six-shooters. The Apaches had acquired as well at least four Sharps carbines, eight Colt revolvers, a number of 1855 model Springfield rifles, and various other converted firearms. Now, they obviously had issues of ammunition and standardization and problems with that. It does appear that the Apaches had some very interesting ways of modifying ammunition and even making their own. And they frequently used their teeth, and this had a very significant impacts on the archaeological surveys. And so it quickly becomes apparent that the Apaches had accumulated a variety of firearms by the time of the battle, and this became apparent during the archaeological survey. And so with a combination of obsolete muskets or plains rifles and other odd caliber, various caliber weapons that the Apaches acquired through raiding, trading, and warfare, often plains rifles that fired odd caliber round balls to begin with, the Apaches had to resort to making their own bullets, which became apparent during the archaeological survey as well. They would cut pieces of lead from bar lead or shave an oversized bullet down to approximate the size of the caliber as best they could. They would then chew on this lead with their teeth until it resembled a rough round ball that would fit into the gun barrel. And this was more an art than a science, as you may imagine. And during the archaeological survey, it became apparent that tooth depressions or bite marks in the lead identify these Apache balls and distinguish them from ammunition used by the Army, whether it was by the troops during the Battle of Apache Pass or Bascom's men, or troops, engaged in target practice at later times in the fort in the area, Fort Bowie. So the tooth depressions in these homemade Apache rifle ammunition and musket balls of odd caliber are all over the battlefield. And so the presence of chewed musket balls is of great significance. And it also demonstrates the ability, the resourcefulness of the Apache, but also some of the limitations on their on their firearms and the reliability of these homemade bullets um, that were just, chewed into an approximate size in order to account for the varying caliber of weapons that the Apache couldn't and didn't fully understand. Now, it's important to note as we discuss the Battle of Apache Pass and the National Park Service excellent archaeological survey of the area, which also includes an excellent history of the battle. Some of the participants left accounts which the National Park Service article relies upon, and so these are primary or significant sources of the accounts of what actually happened at Apache Pass. Now, Sergeant Albert Jennings Fountain leaves a pretty detailed account in the Rio Grande Republican from January of 1891. You also have Captain Roberts's report, as well as John C. Cremoni leaving an account in his work, Life Among the Apaches, as well as the diary of John W. Teal. And so, to introduce the Battle of Apache Pass itself, the advance column under Roberts reaches the Old Stone Stage station as they enter the Apache Pass area, with the cavalry unsaddling their horses, most of the infantry starting to break ranks when they start to hear gunfire towards the west and the rear of the column. Now, as noted, the supply wagons, there were two, of which there were two, one water wagon and the two mountain howitzers pulled by mules brought up the end of the column. So two supply wagons, one water wagon, as well as the mules with the mountain howitzers were under a light guard, probably consisting of the 20 men that were attached to the battery, and they were unable to keep up with the rest of Roberts's column, and so the wagons and artillery had fallen behind. As they crossed a low drainage area of approximately half a mile west of the stage station, the Apaches had taken up position behind the rocks and trees on both sides of the road and opened fire on them. Now, this opening volley came as a complete surprise. It killed a Private Charles O'Brien of Company G of the 1st Infantry attached to the battery. It wounded a teamster, Andrew Shorty Sawyer, in the thigh right away. Now, although wounded, Sawyer mounts his mule, drives his wagon through the hail of gunfire to the safety of the stagecoach station. And at first, the guard on the wagon and supply wagons tries to hold, although they could hardly see the Apaches. Their only targets were puffs of smoke from the rocky areas around this stage station. But as the Apaches start to work their way down the rocky slopes, the guards start to fall back and give ground. And against this onslaught at close quarters, they fall back towards the stage station, and the Apaches overrun the area. And it appears, for a brief period of time anyway, they may have overrun the howitzers. Now, whether they realized this or not and understood what the howitzers were, keep in mind they were disassembled, This may very well have been a key point in the battle, because had the Apaches been cognizant of what a howitzer was and how it was transported, and appreciated just what they had come upon, they could very well have changed the outcome of the Battle of Apache Pass by seizing those howitzers and at least keeping them out of the hands of Roberts and his men. Now, when Roberts hears the sounds of battle, he's not at the rear of the column. He quickly forms his infantry into skirmishers and advances toward the firing. Now, Sergeant Fountain recorded years later in his 1891 memoir, quickly, vigorously, and bravely the men responded to their officer's command. There was no thought of a stampede, no danger of panic. The men fell into line as coolly as if on drill and swept down on the Indians who had assailed their rear guard. Now, as the rear guard, of course, falls back, they run into the approaching infantry skirmishers, and together they rally, they team up, and they advance towards the Apaches. Now, Roberts describes this as a sharp little contest, and in it, the army essentially, in skirmish order, marches forward and marches to the rear of the column, and essentially pushes the Apaches back into the nearby hills. Now, one of the mountain howitzers does see action at this point, and it's assembled and fired at least one parting shot, driving the Apaches over the mountain and in the direction of the spring, Apache Spring. Now, at this point in the fighting, Captain Roberts regroups at the stagecoach station. His command is desperately in need of water, and with the spring still 600 yards up the canyon, he knew they would have to fight for this water supply. Now, this desperation drives the Union forward, not unlike the desperation that drove the Confederates, specifically the Texans under Lockridge, forward at the Battle of Valverde when they overran McRae's artillery. So this is a theme in the Western theater of the American Civil War. You have relatively small numbers of troops fighting in a sparsely populated, unforgiving environment where the logistical issues and the need for water and appropriate supplies to keep the men in the field and to fight off thirst and hunger weigh heavily and affect the tactics and affect the decisions made on the ground at the time. True at Valverde and true for the Confederates, and true again here at Apache Pass for the Federals, the California Column. Now, at this point, Roberts has suffered one casualty. Several men are wounded. He appears to claim about 4 Apaches killed in this initial sharp little contest, as he describes it, where the Federals take back the howitzers and drive the Apaches away from the supply train at the rear and regroup near the abandoned stagecoach station. Now, Roberts devises a simple plan. He divides his infantry into 2 platoons, with the first platoon pushing forward to capture the spring, while Thompson's battery supports it by shelling the high ground around the springs. Now, the 2nd Infantry Platoon would be separated and also deploy as skirmishers and advance along with the battery. The 6th Cavalrymen would support the howitzers. Now, as noted, the men had been on a 40-mile march. They were desperate to fight their way through to water at this point, and Sergeant Fountain recalled Captain Roberts' speech at this point just before this advance, where he breaks up the column into these platoons of skirmishers. Boys, there is the water. We must have it or die. I ask no man to do more than I shall do. I expect no man to do less. There is no place for cowards or skulkers, and if I fail to do my duty, men shoot me down, or by God, I will shoot down the first man who shows the white feather here today. And Fountain goes on to say the men responded with a cheer that shook the rocky ribs of the canyon and told the enemy they still had no easy task before them. Now, several accounts by individuals involved in the battle at Apache Springs have been left behind, and these written accounts provide the basis for understanding the battle. Albert J. Fountain, Sergeant Company E, 1st California Infantry, provided one of the best first-person accounts of the battle, and he led a fairly adventurous life as a newspaperman, a soldier, a scout, Indian fighter, and later a Texas state senator and a lawyer. He played an important role in New Mexico, and he notably left behind an account of this battle in the Rio Grande Republican, where he recounts his participation at Apache Pass on or about January 2nd of 1891. Now, his version gives a detailed account of troop deployments and tactics, correlates well with other historical accounts as well, and field observations tend to corroborate the accuracy of Fountain's account left in 1891. And so the first platoon of skirmishers that Roberts had formed advanced up the center of the valley and faced continuous fire from the Apaches above in the breastworks. Now, with the howitzers shelling the hillsides, the men came within approximately 50 yards of the spring and started cheering as they saw the water, but received heavy fire again from the Apaches, who were hidden and concealed in and around the spring and in this very rocky terrain, not to mention in the fortifications high on the hills above them. And as we mentioned, these were probably fortifications initially built by Bascom's men to defend themselves a year earlier against Cochise, and which were improved upon by the Apaches in anticipation of this battle on the eve of it. And so, seeing this volley killed a private John Barr, sustaining a shot to the head, seeing the first platoon staggered in this way by the Apaches' concentrated fire, Roberts sounded the order to recall and regroup his forces. And indeed, this platoon pulls back, and it quickly becomes apparent that the key to winning this fight for the spring was in seizing the Apache positions on this high ground. And to that end, Roberts orders up the howitzers and instructs them to shell the Apache positions near the tops of the hill. Now, this move forward causes some problems for the howitzer crew. And going back to the logistics and supply issue, it's important to note that the howitzers have both shell and canister, and they also, the crews are armed with their rifles, which we'll note. The approximately 21 men were armed with rifles, in the artillery crew, which becomes significant. Now, when the guns shelled the hillsides from the 400 to 500 yards away, they got fair results with the ammunition that they selected. These were the spherical case shot, a hollow iron ball filled with smaller caliber, about 78, 69 caliber musket balls. And for best results, these shells needed to explode above and slightly in front of the target. Now, because the Apaches held positions high up on the hilltops and in the ridges, a fuse that was cut too long would send the cannonball over the hill and harmlessly explode somewhere in the distance. Now, bringing the howitzers closer to the targets decreased the range to about 200 to 300 yards, making it harder to hit. And this closeness or proximity to the Apaches also exposed the gun crews to the rifle fire and and caused them to be driven away from the guns, at least on one occasion, putting them out of action for a while, and just lessening that constant, rate of fire that's necessary in a battle in order to get the most out of artillery. Now, to make things more complicated, the officers, as we noted, had allowed the men, the artillery crew, to keep possession of their rifles for their own protection. But when Apache crossfire became a problem, the crews abandoned their guns and fought back with their rifles in order to defend themselves. They sought cover out of self-preservation. They stopped firing the artillery, stopped providing fire support to the platoons out there in skirmish order, and defended themselves with their own rifles instead of the weapons they were brought up to fire. And so this creates a problem for Roberts because his artillery crews are shooting back with their rifles and not using the artillery. And so this slows down the rate of the howitzer fire, according to some of the sources. And so finally, by moving the guns closer to the Apache positions, they also couldn't attain the elevation needed to hit the high points up on the ridges. And in order to fix that, the crews start firing from slopes that are too steep to sustain the gun's recoil. And this causes howitzers in some cases to flip over backward. And in one instant, Sergeant Titus Mitchell and John Teal, a private who left a diary, by the way, of Company B, 2nd California Cavalry, had to get up and help to right the gun and put it back on the mounts and use use their ropes and mounts in order to reset the gun. Now, they also dug the tails of these guns into the ground in order to increase the elevation. So there were all sorts of problems with the recoil at these angles, putting too much force on the gun's trail stocks and axle trees, breaking them in some instances, and at one point putting both guns, temporarily anyway, out of action. And you have the cavalry support having to get involved to right the weapons, to get them back into action and to reposition them. And so Roberts realizes at this point, with both howitzers out of action and these technical issues going on, only the infantry could realistically take these hills and reach water, which the whole force desperately needed. So once again, he divides them into platoons, en tirailleurs, in skirmish order, effectively. The first platoon of 20 men, commanded by Sergeant Fountain, who also left that key account of the action in the Rio Grande Republican in 1891, he would take the high hill on the left side of the battlefield. The second platoon of skirmishers would take the hill to the right, and the third would hold the middle and provide essentially covering fire. So Fountain deploys his men as skirmishers and advances on the hill. He later described this method of attack, and this will be familiar to anyone who's familiar with World War II era infantry tactics and American infantry tactics in general. They were, Roberts writes, they were ordered to advance alternately. That is, 10 men would dash 10 or 12 yards to the front, lie down, and then provide covering fire to the other 10 as they made a dash, and so on. We pushed slowly up the hill in the face of a galling fire. And so you have this classic fire and maneuver tactic that essentially is relevant right up and through the Second World War and beyond, especially, in American infantry tactics, where you have a platoon, a group of 10 men, for instance, providing covering fire, going to ground, providing covering fire, another group of 10 men alternately getting up, making a dash, and then lying down and providing covering fire for their partners, for their brothers in arms, colleagues, so that they could then repeat and move forward, each side benefiting from the covering fire of the other. Now, the Apaches also face trouble here, too. The elevation in the terrain creates problems for them because remember, the Apaches are trained with weapons that they've acquired through raiding and trading. They're not well trained and they don't really understand the physics of firearms, especially trajectory. And this is where the Army really has an advantage. The Apaches do not understand the trajectory physics of shooting down a steep hill, and they consistently overshoot Fountain's men. There's an interesting anecdote that Fountain relates from this period, um, where he claims that he lifts his canteen to drink water out of during the battle and has it shot right out of his hand, essentially. And this is not entirely far-fetched because due to the trajectory issues, the Apaches were consistently overshooting the men. Very few men wounded, no one killed during these attacks, despite the galling and constant fire of the Apaches. Again, because the Apaches are not trained effectively in trajectory shooting. They're shooting. They're only practiced with the homemade ammunition, and whatever ammunition they get with the guns is basically short range, and so they're effective at ambushes, but not effective in this type of battle. They simply don't understand the physics of it, and so the troops taking the hill on the right essentially kept the Apaches on that end occupied with the covering fire, and there's really no mention of Fountain's men receiving much crossfire from the hill behind them. And at this point in the battle, anyway, Fountain's men continue moving slowly up the hill, and in his memoirs, again, he writes of this incident near the summit where he lifts his empty canteen to his lips in the vain hope of extracting a drop of water, and there came a flash and a report from a loophole in the breastwork a few yards above me as a bullet passed through the canteen within an inch of my mouth. Now that seems far-fetched, as the NPS article describes, but cannot be discounted. These rocky ridges provide protection for anyone laying down, again, reflecting the infantry tactics of advance, go to ground, provide covering fire. However, if you extend your arms up above or any part of your body up, you're exposing it to fire at that point, especially considering the Apaches not understanding how to aim. Nevertheless, Roberts gives the order to fix bayonets, and Fountain and his men race the last few yards to the fortification, with the Apaches firing off one parting volley, and then overshooting again with ineffective fire, and then run out of sight down the hill and down its slopes. Company E at that point occupied the fortification, this semicircular stone breastwork, 34 feet in diameter approximately, and about only 2 feet high. And with that, they took control of the spring below it. Now Fountain and his men carry the hill. The men cheer. They rush toward the spring to fill anything that would hold water. And the Apaches, who still occupy the right hill, mind you, start firing on the advancing troops. Now Fountain's men, of course, at this point have the high ground advantage and fire down on the Apaches from the left hill, driving them away. At that point, the fighting ceases, and it was after 4 p.m. at this point, and the soldiers go about their business of watering their stock and essentially quenching their thirst. So this is, from 12:30 to after 4 o'clock, you have a fairly intense battle, but one with very, very minimal casualties, at least on the federal side, due to the ranges involved and due to the difficulty of aiming and the Apache inexperience with the physics of trajectory, something that also plagues the federal army, especially with the howitzers and trying to get the guns to operate and keep them in battle. As we noted, issue affects both sides. Now, the soldiers at this point water their horses, and Captain Roberts sends Titus Mitchell and his detachment to locate Captain Cremoni and the wagon train, who were posted further back. And they had orders to inform Cremoni of this day's events and tell them about Roberts's plan to meet him with an infantry escort and essentially reinforce their position at Apache Pass. Now, the 6 men have a very interesting journey, and this has particular consequences for Mangas Colorados, as we'll explain. And this detachment includes Privates Jesse Maynard, Bradley King, Oliver F. Keim, George Young, and John Teal, who goes on to write a diary of his experiences in and around Apache Pass, which is significant. Now, hoping to exit the pass before the Apaches get wind of them, the 6 men ride hard along the old stage road until they reach the flats further west. Now, the stage road runs from the abandoned stagecoach point back out of Apache Pass. So they follow that road. And at this point, Teal appears to walk his horse. So he dismounts to take care of his horse for a while the others keep riding and end up being about 200 to 300 yards in front of him. Now, while this happens, between 2 long hills nearby, the advance party starts taking fire from what Sergeant Mitchell at least believes to be around 40 Apaches hiding behind the rocks and trees in the area. Now, the first volley wounds Private Maynard, fracturing his right forearm and killing his horse. He has to be essentially given a ride out by his comrades. Now, it also wounds Private Keim's horse, but he's still able to ride the animal. Now, 15 to 20 Apaches then come between Private Teal, who is back about 200 to 300 yards, caring for his horse, and the other 5 troops, cavalry troopers. Now, as he sees the attachment retreating and the Apaches coming down toward him, Teal mounts his horse and he tries to outdistance them by riding hard south along the plain. And as the Apaches close in, John Teal's worn-out horse gets hit, bringing them both to a halt. Now, Teal at this point gets off the animal, he dismounts, and at this point it starts to become dusk. It starts to get dark, and he is determined to fight on and protect himself. Now, he gets behind the animal, he brings his horse down, and he hides behind it, and he begins firing his Sharps carbine, hoping that he could somehow survive this. Now, Sergeant Mitchell, seeing this happen and believing the Apaches to be simply too numerous, his 5 men, one of which is without a horse at this point. He feels that they could be of little help to Teal, and following his orders, he heads for Cremoni's camp to bring him the news of the day's events at Apache Pass. Now they arrive at 7:30 p.m., and Private Keim is unable to keep up with them, his wounded horse having eventually passed away about around a mile from the camp, and he decides to retrieve his gear from the animal and walk the rest of the way. He arrives 20 minutes later than the others on foot, and the Apaches are now fully focused on Teal. Now they find that he's well armed. He has his sharps carbine, his pistol, and he's keeping up a continuous fire at the Apaches, who keep their distance and circle around him and just occasionally fire at him out of caution. Teal returns fire at them on his own from a concealed position behind his horse for nearly an hour, and as darkness approaches, he stops. Now, the Apaches at this point seem to believe that Teal has either been hit or is out of ammunition, and their leader, none other than Mangas Colorados, who we discussed earlier and in previous episodes, the great Chiricahua Apache leader. He rides slowly forward. Now, keep in mind, Mangas Colorados is very tall and prominent for an Apache. So he's a very notable target, and Teal takes close aim and fires, knocking him out of his horse. At this point, the warriors, seeing their leader hit, they quickly retrieve him. He's injured, and they withdraw out of Teal's range, essentially sparing Teal. The Apaches' departure is a big relief to Teal, who now focuses his energy on catching up with the rest of his troops. It's night at this point. He pulls all his gear from his horse, takes off his spurs to walk more easily, and begins an 8-mile trek to Captain Cremoni's camp back by the wagon train. Now he walks carefully, avoids groups of Apaches hidden along the way, and he manages to reach Cremoni's camp at 10:30 p.m. that night, where he receives a joyous welcome from his comrades who thought him dead, essentially. But he makes it and goes on to write an account of his experiences. Now, Megan Kate Nelson, in her book, The Three-Cornered War, also details John Teal's encounter with Mangas Colorados that fateful evening. Now, Megan Kate Nelson describes the encounter between Mangas Colorados and Teal as follows. She states that Mangas Colorados and his men emerge from a gully and fire on the cavalrymen. The Chiricahuas close in around Teal, who remounts his horse, and Mangas Colorados throws himself on the ground in order to brace his rifle for a better shot at the Californian, who is frantically turning his mount in circles and firing his gun in every direction to ward off the Apaches. Mangas takes his shot, but Teal saw it coming and leapt out of the saddle. The bullet hit the horse in the chest, and it wheeled off, trailing blood down the road. Teal then crawled through the desert grass, trading gunfire with the Chiricahuas as he moved. And as the sun began to sink, one of Teal's bullets finds its mark, and Mangas Colorados fell back into the arms of his warriors as they dragged him into the darkness. Now that is at the point where the Chiricahuas believe that Teal is wounded or out of ammunition, and they begin to approach him. Mangas, being particularly tall, approaches him slowly, and Teal takes his shot at the tall Apache, essentially knocking him out of the saddle. Now, Mangas Colorados is taken into Mexico to Llanos, I believe, where he's cared for by a local doctor in Mexico. So he's evacuated from the area fairly quickly. And Thomas Roberts, at this point, after gathering water, he abandons his position in the breastwork, seeing pretty clearly that he cannot hold Apache Spring, protect his wagons and supplies, while simultaneously manning the breastworks and defending himself from the Apache overnight, and sending a contingent of cavalrymen back to Captain Cremoni's camp. He realizes he just doesn't have the bandwidth and the manpower to do that, and so he realizes that he has to retreat back the way he had come as well, down the Butterfield Road to where the wagon train was waiting more than 20 miles away. At this point, Cochise directs his men to reoccupy the works around Apache Spring. and sends his scouts to the other Chiricahua camps in order to gather information about their casualties and the status of their warriors. It appears that they had lost 9 men in the fight that day, with many other Chiricahuas injured. Mangos Colorados's wound was serious, and he was, as noted, taken into northern Mexico to the town of Llanos for medical attention. And Cochise then turned his attention back to the Federals, who were marching back along the pass. And this results in what becomes the second day of the Battle of Apache Springs, which is far more successful for the Federals, as we will discuss. Now, Sergeant Albert Fountain describes the march back to Captain Cremoni's camp when Roberts's men come across Maynard's horse, which had been killed, and they fear the worst, believing the Apaches may have wiped out their cavalry. The group of cavalrymen, as well as their supply train, they marched as fast as possible, with Fountain stating, "It was an awful march. The night was dark, and as we staggered on, we expected every moment to come upon the bodies of our slaughtered comrades and the ruins of our plundered train." So, somewhat after 2 a.m., Roberts's command arrives at Cremoni's camp and are relieved to learn of the safe arrival of the entire cavalry detachment. After some rest, they unite with Captain Cremoni and begin the march back to Apache Pass, again around 20 to 30 miles or so, around 5 a.m. on July the 16th. This time, the cavalry, they're prepared and they understand the terrain, at least Roberts's contingent does, and the cavalry rides to the front and the rear of the wagon train, with the infantry marching on either side of it. And at the mouth of the pass, they halt to close up and close ranks, the cavalry dismounting to ride in the wagons as protection, while the infantry marching in skirmish order en tirailleur to the front and the rear of the train, and the cattle directly behind the wagons. The soldiers, of course, can see that the Apaches, who likely believed the howitzers to be inoperable, occupied the fortifications, these breastworks, some of which had been, at least in one area on the western hill, on the left side of the battlefield, on Overlook Hill, to have been the fortifications initially made by Bascom's men during the Bascom Affair. They seem to be in possession of those again and ready for a fight. Now, having run out of water again, Roberts prepares his men once again to attack these higher positions. And there's a big dispute between him and Captain Cremoni, who wants to use his cavalry to charge the Apaches. They had not participated in the fight before, and Cremoni's plan is to allow the artillery to shell the Apache positions and follow this up with a sharp cavalry charge and dislodge them from the area forthwith. This disagreement goes back and forth between Roberts and Cremoni, with Roberts eventually, pulling rank here and insisting on his course of action. And he has the Teamsters drive the wagons into the stage station, into a corral located there, and form a sort of square, securing the mules inside, with 28 Teamsters and wagon masters armed with their rifles and ammunition to guard the train. And we discussed the slightly more antiquated weapons that the Teamsters would have been armed with earlier. Now, the 2 repaired howitzers were placed in the middle of the canyon, where their shelling could do the most damage, and the infantry deployed across the canyon as skirmishers, with the cavalry and skirmish line behind them as a reserve, a dismounted reserve. Roberts signals the order for advance, and this time, with the troops knowing the terrain, Fountain writes the most detailed account of this advance. The little howitzers, spitefully throwing 12-pound shells in spherical case right and left, were pushed up the canyon in line with the skirmishers. The shells burst splendidly, starting the concealed foe from behind their breastworks, and as they fled, the skirmish line accelerated their speed with volleys of rifle fire. The line advanced coolly and deliberately, the men acting as if on drill. This time, faced with the pressure of the howitzers, which were in operation again, and the concentrated, organized skirmish attack of the Californians, the Apaches put up very little fight and quickly leave their fortifications and disappear again into the hills. At this point, the cavalry is unleashed. Cremone's men charge forward, rushing through the skirmish line after the Apaches, who retreat. So the federal forces commit their reserve and they press the Apaches hard until the steep terrain and broken ground brought an end to the horsemen's advance. At that point, the soldiers are clearly in command of the spring, and the Battle of Apache Pass comes to an end, and the men spend the rest of the day fortifying the area, improving the spring, and obtaining much needed water. And there ends the second day of the Battle of Apache Pass. So then, having covered the battle, what do we take away from the Battle of Apache Pass? And we'll certainly look at possibilities for wargaming it and simulating it on the tabletop. But first, in a political sense, in a military sense, in that era, I think it just reinforces the point that I had made regarding the victory in the Mexican American War and how the United States was not particularly prepared to manage or to win the peace that came out of that conflict. And so you appear to have major success in a war, indeed stunning success in a war, causing a fragile, relatively young political system to overheat before it was stable enough to deal with such a stress test. The stress test here being managing a massive amount of territory and being able to digest that effectively without having resolved the slavery issue and other disputes between the states and manage a major international border. And the issues around the new border with Mexico, and particularly the initial treaty obligations under Guadalupe Hidalgo, put the United States on a collision course with the Apache tribes, as well as the Comanche for sure, but particularly the Apache and the Chiricahua, that just turns into a long-term conflict. When you also consider the competition between the northern and southern states in places like Kansas and then beyond, um, to attempt to spread free states as opposed to slave states as those territories were settled and presumably eventually integrated into the Union, this competition between North and South over the new territories creates a serious sense of urgency. And all of this is simply too much for the young democracy to handle, and it affects certainly the timing of the American Civil War, although you could debate as to whether it's a root cause of it or not, slavery issue and other issues between the states being, the primary drivers. But the expansion following the Mexican American War and the westward expansion certainly give an impotence an impetus, an urgency, and affect the timing of when the Civil War breaks out and the fact that it breaks out with such force and with such violence. And so now we'll talk about bringing Apache Pass to the tabletop and skirmish actions like it, such as the Bascom Affair and the first and second day of the Battle of Apache Pass. As we turn back to some of the maps that I shared, which are from the National Park Service article, you can certainly see the nature of the terrain here. There are also the excellent images that I was able to share thanks to the historical marker database. They were taken by Bill Kirchner, and they're just wonderful images of the site of Apache Pass today, the historical marker, as well as Apache Spring and how it appears today. Now, during the time of the battle, it was not overgrown with mesquite and other plant life. It was more barren. But the bottom line from these articles, particularly the NPS article, is that the terrain was very rocky. It was lined with these ridges that had been reinforced by the Apaches. Now, it's important to note that this defensive position that involves the remains of a low rock wall, which exists even today, that was once utilized as a defense by the Apaches during this battle, and it lies near the top of Overlook Ridge. Now, historians assume that the Apaches constructed this fortification prior to the battle or on the eve of the Battle of Apache Pass, it's important to remember that members of George Bascom's command may very well have built it back in February of the previous year, as discussed, during their engagement with the Apaches during the Bascom Affair. And at that period, the Apaches stole most of Lieutenant Bascom's horses and his riding stock from the area, as we talked about during the conflict with Cochise, and this high ground that they occupied enabled them to shoot down on Bascom's men and contributed to their success during the Bascom Affair. Now, Bascom's men did drive off the attack once they were able to retreat uphill to higher ground, and there is speculation from an archaeological standpoint that they could have constructed these fortifications with the manpower available to them. And so there is some disagreement, or at least a lack of clarity, over whether the extent to which the Apaches constructed these fortifications leading up to the Battle of Apache Pass, or whether they were built by Bascom's men previously, and maybe just reinforced by the Apaches to some degree. In any event, um, according to Sergeant Fountain's description, the Apaches used this particular breastwork, this stone breastwork, during the battle, and he describes the breastworks as a circular fortification some 30 feet in diameter on the summit of the hill. The circular feature measures about 32 feet, and in order to portray that on the tabletop, you would certainly need mountainous terrain, whether you're doing it in 15 millimeter or 28 mil. If you wanted to bring the Battle of Apache Pass to the tabletop and wargame it, you would certainly need a significant number of figures to do it 1-to-1 in 28 mil. We're talking about 94 men approximately under Roberts. We're talking about upwards of 200 Apaches, and so possibly representing that in a different way with fewer figures would be in order, or doing it in 15 millimeter would certainly be very interesting. But either way, you would need simple rocky terrain to create the ravines and the valleys, as well as the area where the ambush took place, which was about a half a mile from the abandoned stagecoach center on the Butterfield route. And so you'd have to have a small structure there to represent that, whether you're gaming the Bascom Affair or the larger Battle of Apache Pass, either day one or day two. Day two really being more of a set battle with the organized federal forces. Day one would certainly be interesting as a skirmish, given the ambush and the element of surprise that the Apache had um, that day. However, either way, whether it's the Bascom Affair or the Battle of Apache Pass, I think the implications are definitely interesting for the tabletop. When we talk about the Bascom Affair in terms of rule sets, I think Ruthless could certainly work. Any sort of skirmish rule set would certainly be fun and interesting and present a lot of interesting problems to the commanders on either side. For the Bascom Affair, it's much more than a battle. It's much more than a skirmish, even, because you have an RPG, a role-playing game element there in the objectives of both sides. For the Apaches under Cochise, it's recovering his relatives, which are held hostage. For Bascom, you really have imperfect knowledge. He's trying to recover the Ward boy, but he doesn't know if Cochise really has him or has access to him. And so you really have this unpredictability that's built into what the objectives are for both sides and how realistic those objectives are. So you could certainly build that structure of that sort of choice structure, that decision making structure into the game in an interesting way for the Bascom Affair. Certainly, as we talk about Apache Pass itself, you have some key decisions to make. Now, you do have on the first day, you have the decision by Roberts to attempt to charge the spring first using his infantry, which fails. You have all of the challenges with the howitzers, the mountain howitzers, which would have to be reflected in the rule sets, And you also have the issues with firing. The Apaches were remarkably ineffective. And, given the concentrated fire that they kept leveling at the Californians, it is pretty clear that they didn't receive any casualties during that assault, and they were able to work their way up the hilltop. And this is explained in Megan Nelson's book, as well as in the National Park Service article, essentially hugging the ground, taking advantage of the fact that the Apaches really did not have visibility of them. There was a relatively short space where they did run through the open, but once they were on the ravine areas, especially taking cover and providing covering fire and advancing alternately, they were very difficult for the Apaches to see, let alone hit, based on the materials that I'm citing and that I've read. And so that would certainly come into account in how you set up the terrain and set up the tabletop. Certainly, you would have to adjust the effectiveness of the Apaches at range based on their inability to aim properly, their misunderstanding of how the weapons worked. So they should certainly be far less effective at that type of firing than the Federals. And you could certainly make adjustments like that in the rule set. As far as using smaller scale skirmish rule sets, you could certainly cover the adventurous pursuit that Teal and his squad of cavalry were subjected to when the Apaches chased them down, especially as Teal is surrounded. What if Mitchell had essentially doubled back and attempted to save him? What would have happened to Mangas Colorados, who is injured by Teal, which certainly affected the Apaches to some extent during the second day of the battle. That's certainly a big moment. And if you want a small scale skirmish, that duel between Teal and the Apaches led by Mangus Colorados is certainly an interesting one. As far as the battle goes, you have this dispute between Captain Cremoni and Roberts as to the use of cavalry, and that's a big decision. What if Captain Cremoni's plan had been put into action, using the howitzers to shell the Apaches and unleashing, a quick cavalry charge? Would that have been successful? How would the Apaches have essentially stood up to that? Would the cavalry have been shot down? Given that they couldn't have taken cover and taken the same sort of precautions as infantry in skirmish order. These are all big questions to answer. Ultimately, Roberts makes the decision. He keeps the cavalry back. He has them essentially protect the artillery, the howitzers, and dismount and let the infantry skirmish their way forward, supported by the artillery. And only when the Apaches are essentially scattered or demoralized by that attack does he unleash his cavalry, which has obviously is very effective. And so you have these key decisions that are made during the battle, and these key disputes and these choices, these sort of points where the fighting could have gone one way or the other. And one of the key ones is in the initial ambush. Now, the Apache strategy here was to ambush the rear of the federal force. Now, in doing so, they they lose the element of surprise. They launch this small scale attack on the rear of the column, and then they alert the main column where Roberts is and the majority of the infantry are to the fact that Apaches are present. And so they don't get to spring their main ambush at the spring because the Californians are wise to the fact that there's a large Apache presence here because of this diversionary attack on the rear. You could perhaps see why the Apache commanders did that. They wanted to try to put pressure on the federal forces in the rear to startle them, to perhaps converge upon them in some way, but in doing so, they lose the element of surprise. Furthermore, in this initial ambush at the rear of the column, it's pretty clear that if they don't overrun the mountain howitzers, which are disassembled on mules at that point, they at least drive the teamsters and the other other troops away from those howitzers. And so if the Apaches had understood what they were, it seems pretty clear that they could have destroyed them, made off with them, scattered the mules, essentially deprived the Federal forces of their artillery for the duration of the battle. But it's not clear that the Apaches understood what these mules were carrying. It's not really clear that they had any understanding of what the howitzers were, especially if they were disassembled. And so it's a huge missed opportunity. Um, so that's a whole decision that the Apache player may have to make. When and where do you spring your ambush? If you do attack the rear of the column, you really need to follow through on that. You really need to scatter the supply stock, the supply animals, or at least seize the howitzers. But again, historically, the Apaches didn't see that. They didn't understand what the howitzers were, and it remains, in my opinion anyway, a huge missed opportunity for them. And so, as I said, you have a lot of interesting questions posed by the skirmishes at Apache Pass, as well as the Bascom Affair. And I hope that this video has been helpful. I hope everyone has enjoyed learning about the history of this battle. I would encourage you to visit the Historical Marker Database website where you could view some of these images, as well as read through the National Park Service article and materials about Apache Pass, because it's a very interesting story. It's interesting militarily, and bringing these types of actions to the tabletop gives you some insight into the Old West during the Civil War that is exciting and involves a lot of interesting choices. So that said, I hope you've enjoyed the figures that I've put together for you, and the images that I've organized. And as always, keep on rolling dice, keep on painting miniatures, keep on enjoying your hobby, and I hope everyone has a wonderful week.